Salman Rushdie, noted writer and the author of over a dozen novels, will be speaking. He's the keynote speaker for the dinner session. He'll be introduced by Arun Puri, the editor-in-chief of India Today.
Good evening to everybody. Sir Salman Rushdie, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here to introduce our keynote speaker tonight. We've actually been trying to get him for many years. He doesn't know that, but he's a busy man. We finally got him here. His life story evokes as much global interest as his novels. A small price for being the most famous novelist in the world. Mostly on account of his novels, but to a small part for the prize put on his head. It was a prize put by a desperate revolutionary who was looking for an enemy to sustain his great Islamic revolution more than 2 decades ago. As a storyteller and an essayist, he is relentless in defying the frontiers of imagination and arguments. He began with a bang nearly 3 decades ago, to be exact, in 1981, when Midnight's Children shattered the cozy calm of English fiction. The first cry of Salim Sanai chimed with India's freedom, and the novelist himself, a Bombay chokra, as he describes himself often, was hardly 2 months older than his protagonist. Never before has India been imagined with such magical exuberance and subversive energy. Never before has the history of the subcontinent looked so delightfully chutneyfied. Never before has the English language been bhel-purified with such panache. Midnight's Children was a cultural event. Winning Booker, and on 25th anniversary of the prize, the Booker of Bookers. It would become a cult classic, and its creator a cultural icon. We are still indebted because it inspired a generation of Indians to imagine India in English. The boom in Indian writing in English that would go on to get fat advances and fancy awards and dazzle the lit markets of the world was born. It would have never been possible without that pioneering performance from the Bombay-born, Cambridge-educated, London-based ad agency copywriter. Born handcuffed to history, he would never be able to escape the subcontinent. The grammar of his imagination would remain essentially Indian, though his home would become increasingly imaginary or global. Shame, his next novel, a parable set in some place like Pakistan and written in his trademark Bougainvillea prose, would bring out the perversions of power. Then came the satanic verses, and everything changed. Everything that we thought was sacred in a civilized world. The book, dissent, freedom, and tolerance all came into question. A novel about transmigrations and death and about loss of faith. The verses was more burnt than read. From Bradford to Islamabad, the street fighters of religion made a bonfire of it. Unfortunately, India was the first country to ban it. Here too, they did not read the book, but banned it still. It is a victim of India's infamous vote bank politics. Inadvertently, India Today had a small role to play in this. One of our journalists, in fact, was given a proof copy by Salman in London, and we were the first to review it. Saeed Shahabuddin, the chief proponent of the ban, had not read the book, but only the review in India Today. He notoriously said, "I do not have to wade through a filthy drain to know what filth is." Some logic, I would say. And on Valentine's Day in 1989, Rushdie lost his freedom. The irony could not have been starker. Elsewhere in the world, the Iron Curtain was being torn down, but writer Salman Rushdie's neck was put on the block. He was sentenced to death by the late Ayatollah Khomeini of Iran. Following the fatwa, Rushdie vanished. He became the fugitive, the hunted, with a price tag on his head. In retrospect, it was the first manifestation of the extraterritorial terror of radical Islam. I believe the burning book set the stage for the burning towers. From fatwa to jihad, it was not such a long journey. Perhaps if the world had united and stood up to this first voice of radical Islam, maybe they would not have had the steam to travel this distance. Probably it was our failure to rally behind Rushdie that in a sense gave fundamentalism the freedom to fly. But for Rushdie, it was his love for the story that kept him alive in exile. And most of his post-fatwa novels, The Moor's Last Sigh, The Ground Beneath Her Feet, Shalimar the Clown, and The Enchantress of Florence, were acts of homecoming as well. India never left his imagination. Bombay, as he would pun, was his Wombay. And when I was looking back at our back issues, I realized how much he mattered to us. No other writer has got as many pages as he has in India today. We had exclusive features on most of his novels, and we're looking forward to his next one, the sequel to the fabulous Haroun and the Sea of Stories. I must also mention that in 2007, much to the anger of the Muslim world, Rushdie was honored with a knighthood by the Queen. Protests from Iran and Pakistan warned of suicide bomb attacks. The honor came in the wake of Rushdie's comments on Islamic totalitarianism and the veil which he said sucks. From British conservatives were angry because the country spent so much money on protecting the left liberal Rushdie, who even caricatured Thatcher as Lady Torture. But that's Rushdie for you, hated and honored at the same time. Tonight, we have in him the most qualified person to speak on dissent and freedom. The topic could be the briefest description of his life as a writer as well. Rushdie is one of its most inspiring embodiments. He's a global citizen, a public intellectual, and a natural dissident, and of course, a great storyteller. As one of his characters said, and I quote, "I learned how to hold the galaxy in the palm of a man's hand." It could well be the description of his art. It is a great enchantment watching him doing that. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Sir Salman Rushdie.
Well, thank you for that wonderfully eloquent introduction, and I will try to live up to it. It seems difficult. One of my favorite moments in modern literature is a scene from the American novelist and Nobel laureate Saul Bellows' novel, The Dean's December. In this novel, an American academic, Dean Albert Cord of the University of Chicago, at one point visits Romania. His wife is Romanian, and they visit one winter on family business. And this is, of course, Romania long before the fall of communism, Ceausescu's Romania, an alarming country, wretched, restricted, and bleak. And there's a moment in the novel when Cord is standing at the window of his wife's family's apartment, looking out at a frost-whitened park, and he hears a dog in the distance beginning to bark. And the dog barks on and on and on. And because this is a dog in a Saul Bellows novel, it is necessary for the Dean to speculate on what the dog is talking about. And he decides that the interminable barking is the dog's protest against the limitations of dog experience. And that what the dog is trying to say in its agony is, for God's sake, open the universe a little more. Open the universe a little more. I remember when I first read that sentence, I immediately thought, that is as good a description of the purpose and nature of art as I've ever read. This is what all artists, verbal, visual, musical, dramatic, cinematic, strive to do, and the degree to which they succeed depends upon their individual talents. The great artist can make the universe feel greatly enlarged. The lesser artist must settle for less. The bad artist fails in the attempt, but all art wants to push against boundaries, to increase by some small amount the sum total of what it's possible to imagine, to think, to know, to feel, and therefore finally to become and to be. The point is that you cannot push against boundaries by remaining in the safe middle ground. You actually have to go to the frontier and shove. And of course there is a place for the safe middle ground. There is a place for popular forms of all kinds, for books and movies and shows that seek only to entertain. All of us, myself included, sometimes ask for nothing more than entertainment, an exciting film, a foot-tapping tune. None of us wishes to eat haute cuisine every day. Sometimes a snack or a bite of junk food is what hits the spot. But true art tries to go to some sort of an edge, linguistic, technical, thematic, even moral. And boundary pushing inevitably involves a certain element of risk, because at the frontier there are always frontier guards, many of them self-appointed, who do not want boundaries to be pushed back, who would in fact greatly prefer it if the sum total of what it is possible to say and think and be was to be reduced. Forces that favor a narrowing rather than a broadening of the discourse. These are often powerful forces, and they push back against the artist's effort, often with distressing consequences for the artist. Art itself is often more durable than artists. The poet Mandelstam was killed by Stalin, but the poetry of Mandelstam survives. The poet Ovid's life was ruined when the Emperor Augustus exiled him to the Black Sea, but the poetry of Ovid survives. The poet Lorca was murdered by the thugs of Franco's Falange, but the poetry of Lorca also survives. And in fact, as such cases demonstrate, the art persecuted at one moment in history often lives on to define that very moment in the eyes of future generations. The Impressionist painters were mocked at first. The term Impressionism itself was coined to satirize them as painters who could not paint properly, but only give an unfinished impression of their subject. Wallpaper in its embryonic state is more finished, wrote one critic in 1874. Less than 100 years later, the Impressionists are at the heart of the artistic establishment, at the very center of European culture, their paintings forming the cornerstones of most of the great museum collections around the world. As Paul Simon once sang, one man's ceiling is another man's floor. What one age condemns, the next rejoices in. Myself, I have taken inspiration all my life from the liberal and open-minded culture into which I was born. The infinitely plural and endlessly stimulating world of post-independence India. My family played a large part in shaping my way of thinking. My father's people lived for several generations in the famous Old Delhi Mohalla of Ballimara, the Ballimara of Mirza Ghalib, and my father grew up with poetry filling his head. My family's name was not Rushdie then. My paternal grandfather was named Khwaja Muhammaddin Khaliqi Dehlvi. And Rushdie was a name my father chose, made it up, to simplify matters, picked because of his admiration for the Andalusian Muslim philosopher Ibn Rushd, Averroes to the west, the author of the celebrated Tahaffut, the incoherence of the incoherence, his spirited reply to Ghazali's Incoherence of the Philosophers, in which he, Ibn Rushd, defended human thought, philosophy, against the hardline argument advanced by Ghazali that much philosophy, such as the thought of Aristotle and Ibn Sina, was contrary to Islam. My father greatly admired Ibn Rushd's arguments against Islamic literalism and in favor of interpretation, of openness, which are the brilliant precursors of an argument that continues right up to today. Good name to choose.